Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. For almost all the elections in our lifetime, we have been focused on the almost magical quality of Election Day and the outcomes. Who would win and who would lose was at the root of our personal and sometimes partisan anxiety and of all of our electoral efforts. This time, though, it's different. The anxiety goes not just to the actual outcome, but how we get there. The vote counting, the media coverage, and the fear that we are in uncharted territory, lacking clarity, leadership, and even the simple reassurance that it will all be okay. The Electoral College, the post office, exit polling, the red and blue maps, things that we have come to assimilate into our collective and sometimes exciting sense of what traditional American elections are all about, have all come under siege, and no one seems to feel good about any of it. It's as if thunderstorms had wiped out 4th of July parades from coast to coast. Joining me to try and put some of this in both historical and contemporary perspective is my guest, Edward Foley. Professor Foley directs the election law program at Ohio State University, where he teaches law and was a Solicitor General for the state of Ohio. He participated in the 2019 National Task Force on Election Crisis, and last year he published a paper entitled Preparing for a Disputed Presidential Election, an exercise in election risk assessment and management. He's the author of the recent book Presidential Elections and Majority Rule, and published a Washington Post op-ed a couple of weeks ago on the falsehood of election delay. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Edward Foley to the Who, What, Why podcast. Ned, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
There's so much talk. I don't think there's a day that goes by that we don't see something or hear something where somebody says, gee, if only the Electoral College didn't exist, if only it was a direct election. But the truth of the matter is that up until about 1992, this was really never an issue, never a problem that we encountered in the same way. Talk about that historical context first.
Sure. No, it's absolutely right that for essentially most of the 20th century, the Electoral College both functioned as it was supposed to and functioned in a way that was consistent with this idea of the national will in general. So it didn't seem like the apparatus was causing problems. You're right, starting in 1992 with Ross Perot's independent candidacy that made it really a three-person race. It's normally you only have two candidates on the debate stage, but Ross Perot was on the debate stage, and that was, I think, a factor in everybody's mind, and it did affect the way in which the infrastructure handled three candidates. If we go all the way back to the 19th century, what I didn't realize actually until I did work for the book was that our electoral college is the second electoral college. The first one was in the original Constitution, but it fell apart in the election of 1800, and they put it back together with quite different premises philosophically, and then mechanically it was very different for the election of 1804, which is Thomas Jefferson running for re-election. And it was really built with him in mind and with the concept of two-party competition in mind. The founders in Philadelphia in 1787 had hoped to avoid partisanship and political parties, if you can believe it, and of course they did not get their way, and the parties appeared quite quickly and became ferociously competitive. And if any of you have seen the musical Hamilton, the great musical, you know about 1800 as the Aaron Burr and Jefferson and Hamilton and all those folks, and it was ugly. But Jefferson ends up president, and they realize they've got two-party competition, and they rebuild the Electoral College. And then what they forget, though, is there could be more than two parties. So the world that they live in at the moment is just the Federalists versus the Jeffersonians. They don't think about Ross Perot or Ralph Nader or the Green Party or Jill Stein. And this is a long, complicated story, but to cut to the chase, the 20th century manages to handle this for the most part until recently. And then we can talk about 1992, we can talk about 2000, and we can talk about 2016, and our apparatus does not match the reality of competition or kind of our expectations of the way the system's supposed to work.
And 1992 was unique and sui generis in many ways because of a third-party candidate being so actively involved. But then something else happened in terms of the change in the makeup of the electorate that really led us to 2000 and 2016.
The hope is that the voting system can handle the voters. We did get, the National Voter Registration Act, or so-called motor voter, which did expand voter registration. And the goal, I think, for most of us who believe in popular sovereignty, government of the people, by the people, for the people, hopes that all adult citizens, our voters, are able to register and participate, and the turnout is high. Regrettably, we've often had lower participation rates than is desirable. If you have an image of everybody participating, so our system should be able to handle everybody voting. Of course, the other problem that we've seen both this year with the pandemic, but even, for example, President Obama had to create a long lines commission because there were 4 or 5, 6-hour lines, people trying to vote, in his election, and that's troubling for a law person like me, because the legal infrastructure should be able to handle anybody who wants to vote. And if you've got 4 or 5, 6-hour lines, your system is not working properly.
What else is it in the system that is leading us to situations like 2000, 2016, and clearly what could be the case again in 2020, where the electoral vote and the popular vote are not in sync?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, and here are some philosophical views are important. Just to put the cards on the table, I would be happy to get rid of the Electoral College and replace it with a so-called national popular vote, where the voter, a voter in California and a voter in Iowa and one in Delaware and Florida, they all count equally, and it's all one big pool, and you count them all. I do think there's an important distinction between a so-called plurality winner, which just is, whoever gets the most votes, versus a majority winner, which is more than 50%. And again, those two things mean the same thing if there are only two candidates, because by definition, more in a two-person race is a majority. And so when they built the 12th Amendment, which is our current and second electoral college, and they built it for two-party competition, they got confused about this distinction between plurality and majority. They knew they wanted majority winners. They actually talked about that, but they didn't think they had to worry about it too much, because the world that they then lived in was us versus them. And so it's when the third party or the independent candidate comes along that this distinction between a plurality result and a majority result matters immensely. And the Electoral College itself says you have to win a majority of electoral votes. But the way it's implemented at the state level, states can choose how they appoint their own electors. And again, when they wrote the 12th Amendment, they expected every state to require a majority choice to appoint electors, because that's the way it was done back then. That disappeared after Andrew Jackson and later in the 19th century, and that's the kind of change that catches up with us. So when we talk today about the national vote and the discrepancy between the national vote and the Electoral College vote, I think it's important to drill down into that. So let's go to 2016, because a lot of people talk about how Hillary Clinton won the national vote but not the Electoral College. That's all true, but she did not get a majority of the national vote. She got more votes, 3 million more votes essentially than Trump, but it was still a plurality. It was under 50%. Trump gets a majority of the Electoral College, but what most people don't know, because the media doesn't focus on this, is the way in which President Trump achieved his Electoral College majority. He gets over 100 electoral votes, a third of his total, in states where he's under 50% in the state, and yet he's getting all the electoral votes from those states. So all the battlegrounds that we're talking about this year, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all of those states, Trump is under 50% in the popular vote. So there are more votes against him than for him, if you will. and yet he's getting all the electoral college votes from all of those states. Florida has 29 electoral votes. Trump gets all 29. He's under 50%. That's and part of the reason why I wrote the book is that didn't make sense from the little that I knew at the time about the system. So I wanted to dig in and try to figure it out. And it turns out that's just not how the system's supposed to work. They expected that if you were going to get Florida's votes, you would be the majority preferred candidate in Florida, not a minority candidate, not a plurality winner. Same in any other state. Because what they thought, their conception of majority rule, this is the Jeffersonians, this is with Thomas Jefferson in mind, their conception was you get a national majority in the Electoral College by building a series of state-based majorities. So Thomas Jefferson is the majority preferred candidate in Virginia over John Adams. Same in Pennsylvania, same in New York, and so forth. Not in Massachusetts, obviously, they like John Adams. But if you accumulate enough state-based majorities, that will give you your Electoral College majority. And they thought that was an appropriate conception of majority rule for a United States of America that was a federation of states. So I think there's 2 points to think about. One is if we just want to be true to the philosophy of the system as it's supposed to exist, we would try to implement it. And so we would try to figure out who's the majority preferred in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Florida, and then build your Electoral College off of that. But we don't do that. And so the system is kind of going awry from that perspective. And actually, 1992, again, and this is a nonpartisan point or a bipartisan point. It's just an analytical point about how to structure the system so that the citizens get what they want according to the rules as it's supposed to work. Bill Clinton's full name is William Jefferson Clinton, but I sometimes joke that he's the least Jeffersonian winner, despite his middle name, because the only state that he wins a majority in the state is his home state of Arkansas, plus the District of Columbia. Every other state that gives him electoral votes, he's under 50%. Sometimes he's under 40%. And, the George H.W. Bush folks say, well, wait a second, it's all because of Ross Perot. If it had just been a two-person race, I would have won. Now, political scientists disagree with that, and the point is we don't know because we don't have ranked choice voting or other mechanisms at the state level to give us majority answers. And that's what's inconsistent with the majority rule premise of the Electoral College. Now, if we wanted to replace the Electoral College, as I would happily do with a constitutional amendment, we would have to have a choice of whether, even if we pool everybody's vote nationwide into a single pot, we still have to answer the question, are we going to have a majority winner or not? And most citizens, when they think about democracy, they do think majority rule because you think, well, you need that mandate of a majority because that's more, right? I mean, if there's going to be disagreement and one side's going to win and one side's going to lose, you think the majority side should prevail. Yes, we protect minority rights through the Equal Protection Clause and the First Amendment, so we don't want tyranny of the majority, but we also don't want the majority to have to suffer under minority rule. That seems undemocratic, small d democratic. But if we implement majority rule in a national popular vote, we would have to have some mechanism, whether it was Congress or otherwise, to get to that majority winner in terms of a winnowing. Because if you have three candidates, if Jill Stein wants to run or Kanye West wants to run, you've got to figure out how you narrow down from a field of multiple candidates to the two finalists who because once you get to two finalists, you can definitely get a majority winner. It's when you have more than two candidates that it's trickier.
Right. I mean, it's entirely possible to have a situation where you have a candidate that gets minority votes in a ton of different states, and wins the popular vote, a nationwide majority, by getting 5 million or 6 million extra votes in California or New York, for example.
Right. So we may see this year. I mean, there's so many different outcomes that could happen, but different from 2016. We may see, it is at least some of the modeling shows, that Vice President Biden could get an outright majority nationwide, over 50%, and still lose the Electoral College. That I think would count in my mind as a failure of the system even more so than 2016. The system kind of malfunctioned in 2016 for the reasons that we talked about, but the malfunction would be even more severe and in a way qualitatively different if that happened. Then you would really have to ask the question, why do we want this Jeffersonian model anymore? Because the Jeffersonians would have said, we don't care about a nationwide aggregate, because we do care. We are trying to add up majority choice in Virginia, majority choice in New York, majority choice in Pennsylvania. But they would have said, if you win New York 9-1 and Pennsylvania 9-1, that's irrelevant, because once you're above 50%, that's all. So we don't want majority choice in Virginia and South Carolina and Maryland swamped by somebody who just runs up the score in New York. I mean, again, you can disagree with that philosophy, but they were clear that was they had what we can call a compound conception of majority rule, and I think most Americans today think it should be just a simple nationwide majority.
The overlay to all of this, of course, as complex as it is this whole issue in this coming election about how the votes get counted, how long it takes, as you wrote about in your op-ed piece in the Post, what constitutes a delay, and the other aspect, which is something you've written quite a lot about. In fact, you coined the phrase of this blue shift in the way votes shift during the counting process. Talk about that.
Sure. No, happy to. And I think the most important first point is it's always been true that anything we hear on election night is unofficial and preliminary. And when the networks themselves, whatever terminology they use, sometimes they say they're declaring a winner or calling the race or whatever, they have no legal status to do that. They do that as a service to their audience, which is fine, because it takes 2 or 3 weeks to get a official result in a legal sense. You have to have the certification of the canvassing of the returns, and you want that for accuracy. And so from a rule of law point of view, it's that certification which defines the winner on a state-by-state basis. But usually and historically, the election night tally, which is preliminary, has given you an incredibly high confidence that that's going to match 2 to 3 weeks later with the official certification. So that's allowed us to feel comfortable having the networks call it and then rely upon that. But we just need to understand, especially this year, that there aren't any true results in a legal sense on an election night. So if anybody's telling you we've got to know an answer on election night, that's just not understanding as a matter of law how the system works. The other piece to this, and this gets to the blue shift point, is the ability to make that confident projection on election night is entirely dependent on the ratio of in-person ballots versus mailed ballots, absentee ballots. Because, in states and places where, historically, where the vast majority of the ballots are in person, they can have that preliminary tally right after the polls close. The precinct workers, run them through the machines. You get a preliminary count, and again, you're confident that that's going to be the final count. And if absentee ballots are only 5% or less of the total, they're going to split not exactly 50-50, but they're probably not going to change the results. So that's what allows you to make the projections. If you go into an election like this year, where in many states that ratio shifts, and it's going to be 50% vote by mail, maybe 80%, in some states close to 100%, if not 100% vote by mail, you can't make the same kind of projection, especially if it's a a purple state or closely contested. But that's not nefarious. Nothing is wrong about that. And it's driven entirely by voter choice, because in most states, even the states that aren't so-called universal vote by mail, but just have gone to what's called no excuse vote by mail, where you, the voter, can vote by mail if that's your choice. You don't need a medical reason or anything like that. You get to decide what's your preference. So that ratio is not determined by the government anymore. It's determined by each voter making a decision and all those collective decisions. So that's why we may just have to be patient, because the projections may be, the networks understanding this may say, well, we're just not going to project. Now, what's the blue shift? The blue shift is a phenomenon that has developed because of the increased reliance on vote by mail, primarily, also provisional voting. All of these reforms in our legal structure are good things that have come out of a way to improve the system because of the problems of the 2000 election, Bush versus Gore and hanging chads, and the long lines problems that we were talking about, and so forth. And so we now want to improve the process. But a collateral consequence of that improvement is increasing the ratio of ballots that are just not available to be counted on election night. And turns out that those ballots tend to be more democratic in nature. That's why we call it blue, right? Blue versus red. Nothing nefarious. Again, that's all voter choice. It just so happens that there is this persistent pattern. It's not every state, it's not every election, but there's been a consistent trend in that direction since 2004.
Part of what had gone on previously in terms of whether it's the networks or Associated Press or what have you, calling these elections, is that it was based on a certain degree of statistical modeling, that if you know, for example, how 50% of the people voted or 60% of the people, how they voted, that statistically the other 40% or the part that isn't counted will probably break the same way, essentially. What this blue shift idea does, and what these reforms that you talk about have done, is really change that equation entirely.
Yes, I think that's right. Now, and I'm not inside any of these network decision desks, and some of that's proprietary, but there have been some public conferences over the last month or so as everybody's getting a better understanding of how things are different and will be even more different because of the virus. I mean, I think one thing to really emphasize is the blue shift was occurring before the pandemic hit, because of these other changes that were post-2000 that were good reforms. So we were starting to see the blue shift as a new consistent trend. I mean, I first noticed this in 2012, for example, and so wrote about it then, and also we saw it in 2018. It turned out to be quite significant and caught some people by surprise, and so I went back and looked at it again, as you said, in a paper written last year. So that was all before the pandemic. I think most people now understand that the even much greater reliance on vote by mail because of the pandemic, and also the differential partisan reaction to the whole vote by mail issue that President Trump has kind of put into the national conversation in the way that he has, it's caused this real partisan differential between how Republicans sort of feel about the electoral process versus Democrats. And so that's why we could very likely see the election day results being much more redshifted, if you will, relative to the total count. So the degree of disparity between the preliminary count on election night and then the secondary count after all the mailed ballots are counted, could be much more pronounced than the past. And that's going to affect the networks and their modeling. And I think they realize that, but I also think they're trying to play catch up in the sense that they don't want to abandon the role of making projections if they can. They're just going to be cautious about it. They are all publicly saying it's more important to get it right than get it fast, and I think that's good. But they want to inform their viewers of what they're capable of saying, and there's some value to that. I mean, there's risks, in other words, you don't want networks calling races too soon, and that would be a very bad mistake. On the other hand, you don't want to invite a sense of uncertainty that is also non-existent. So if, again, that we have no idea what election night's actually going to look like, because it could be multiple scenarios, but if the early vote is actually much bluer than expected, and you know from all the reasons we're talking about it's going to get even more bluer over the next 2 weeks, then it would be misinforming the public to say, well, we don't know what's going on because we only have 50% of the vote in and we're waiting for another 50%. I think I don't want to try to tell the networks what to do, but just from a law perspective, it would be appropriate to say we're not going to get a legal result for 2 or 3 weeks, but based on demographic analysis and historical trends, if the early results are looking this good for Team Blue, there's reasons to expect that it's going to continue. The other scenario to think about is if the early results look really good for Team Red, that's a situation where those early results may dissipate because of the blue shift phenomenon that is to be expected. So I think how you talk about it and think about it really depends on which context you're in and what you know and what you don't know. And as long as the public is properly informed and it's all transparent and you're not declaring winners based on projections, hopefully we'll at least have an understanding of the situation.
The other aspect is that the blue shift that you identified and have written and talked about was, as you said, before the pandemic. It's really not clear how it's going to play out in the context of the pandemic, and we could find that the blue shift, in fact, may be less pronounced in the pandemic. We just don't know because of the change in circumstance.
No, I think that's right. In fact, my first assessment or tentative assessment post-pandemic was precisely that if everybody was now going to be voting by mail, essentially, because of the pandemic, that would tend to diminish the
right.
blueness of and that therefore one shouldn't be overly expectant of that. And so but I've adjusted that sense of it as a result of, again, this public conversation where President Trump is so hostile to vote by mail and we started to see public opinion research coming from Pew and Gallup and all the other organizations basically telling us that Democrats were planning to vote by mail and Republicans weren't, that I had to reassess the situation based on that updated information, recognizing this is all tentative and very volatile. But then even since then, with Michelle Obama at the convention suggesting that if you're healthy, maybe you want to try to vote early in person, and the postal service, all the problems associated with that, it may be that there is something of the pendulum may swing back, and if it turns out that in fact there's not that much of a disparity between Republicans and Democrats in mode of voting this year, again, then we could be back to the situation where there's not that much of a blue shift, because yes, we're getting lots of absentee ballots, but a lot of them are red and a lot of them are blue, so don't expect a big, disparity there. So I agree with you that we should not jump to any conclusions, and we should, recognize that this, because of the pandemic, this is going to be an especially volatile year, and we have to be able to assess the circumstances as they arise.
And it really brings us to the final point, which you wrote about in your post piece, that if we don't know particular results, if we don't know the total results, or we don't know state results on election night, that's not a delay. It's just part of the process playing out in a different way.
Exactly. That's the key point. Because what I fear with the delay narrative is that plays in the hands for people who want to say something's going wrong. The word delay or the word late, that's pejorative, I think. That's based on a frame that you ought to have an answer and you don't. And then if you take that the next step and say, well, because something's going wrong, we can't trust it, I think that's problematic. I think one of the most disappointing things that might happen this year, I certainly hope it doesn't, is that the system actually works well enough to give us an authentic, true result. In other words, that the outcome that the system reveals is the one that the voters as a group genuinely wanted. That's the system working. But if so much doubt has been thrown over it in the public conversation that people don't even trust the valid results, that's really undermining popular sovereignty. You can't have self-government unless you can trust the results of self-government. So that's why I think the word delay is wrong, because it's inaccurate, because it's not a delay. There's no delay as a matter of law until we get to this. There are a couple of dates in December. If you miss those dates, then yes, things start to be a delay and late. But from the structure of our system, Congress has given states until December 8th is one key date and December 14th is the other. So, let's pick December 8th for sake of argument. Nothing is late unless a state is missing that December 8th deadline. And then the states have their own rules for when they're supposed to certify results. So the fact that we're waiting for the certification to come true and to see what the projections were, that none of that's late. That's just a system working according to its own schedule.
Is it your sense, having evolved this idea of the blue shift, that if the pandemic wasn't part of the equation right now, and we just don't know the effect that's going to have because it's too much of an unknown, but that the blue shift, as you've seen it evolve just since 2012, is something that could be projected and put into mathematical models in terms of projections?
Yeah, probably. Again, remember, I'm a law person, not a statistician. I've co-authored with a great political scientist named Charles Stewart at MIT, who really can crunch the numbers. And so anything I'm about to say on this point, I really learned from him and his colleagues in his field. And so I do think, there is the capacity to do some of that statistical and demographic analysis, so that, if you knew where the absentee votes were going to come from, urban versus rural, those sorts of things, again, it's a little bit like relying on exit polls, right? I mean, but that it also makes things a little dangerous, because it is modeling as opposed to just a preliminary count. I mean, some of the network's projection is based on exit polls. Some of it is based on, okay, the precincts tally isn't certified, but we have actual preliminary numbers from the precincts. And so I'm always more confident if I can know that the networks are relying not just on exit polls, but a preliminary count of real ballots.
But very difficult to convince people of it in a world in which they can get anything they want at the click of an app.
Yes, I know, I agree. I mean, I think, with Twitter and everything, I mean, we are a culture that is increasingly so over the decades of instant gratification. I do think it's on the media and the networks to try to explain what you and I took a few minutes to talk about. I don't think it's impossible to understand this point. It may go against our ingrained psychology. The thing that worries me, I think the networks are at the point now where they're sort of they're halfway there to where they need to be, because they understand that as you were saying, the modeling is going to be very different, and they need to be tentative about projections. But the other half, I don't think they've quite got the vocabulary and the mindset right, in that they still think that they still are using this terminology of delay. They're still frustrated by the fact that they're not going to have an answer, and they're not willing to sort of acknowledge that they're the cause of this, in the sense that it's only because of their practice of projections that we've come into this expectation of having it on election night or sooner, right? So delay is only in reference to the media desire and public culture desire for instant gratification. But since that's a product of the media world, the media kind of owes it to all of us to try to undo that expectation as much as possible.
I don't expect any kind of a vow of no projections until all the results are in.
No, I agree with that. But couldn't the media, again, if they say these are only projections, And if they're careful to say, when you learn the true result in a few weeks, don't think of that as delayed. Think of that as because that's according to calendar, right? I mean, the state law has a deadline. Again, it's different state to state, but let's say a state has a deadline of certification 3 weeks from Election Day. As long as the state meets that deadline, there's no delay, right? So the media, I would hope the media could say, any waiting that you're doing between now and 3 weeks from now is not delay. It's waiting because we can't project the way we normally do. Why? Not because of any problem, nobody's fault. It's this ratio. It's that the nature of vote by mail means we can't project the way we used to. It doesn't mean the government is doing anything wrong. It certainly doesn't mean there's any fraud. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong. It just means we, the media, can't project. And so if you want to think about it as a delay, it's just a delay in the world of projections. It's not a delay in the world of vote counting.
Professor Edward Foley, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you. I enjoyed the conversation, and good luck, as you say, as we watch from now to November.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.